Uh, I started in the pre-engineering program and then I transferred into computer engineering. I probably don't look like someone with disabilities to you, but I probably don't look like someone with disabilities to you, but and maybe like when I'm walking, you may notice I have like a slightly different gait because what is it called? I tend to walk on my toes, but if you saw me overall in class or in a Zoom class, you probably want to think I'm someone who has a disability. And this is important because not all disabilities are visible. And the first thing I want to say before I get into my own disabilities is not everyone is comfortable with disclosing their own disabilities. I'm comfortable disclosing them because I think not only it'll help you guys understand what's going on with people who have disabilities, but it also is my personal choice that I'm okay disclosing them. Some students, when either in class or your peers or whoever, may not be comfortable disclosing them. So that's important when providing accommodations to not, I don't want to say force or coerce, but to not like lead into, oh, like what were you specifically diagnosed with? So I was diagnosed so in age six or seven-ish, I was put into a special education program in my kindergarten class because I was deemed a child with special needs. And at age 12, I was diagnosed with ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, and developmental coordination disorder, as well as frontal lobe and executive functioning disorder. If anyone knows what the DSM is, those are the codes for that, but I don't know if people know about that. What's important about that is, the thing is, you may be wondering, okay, so those are my diagnoses, but how does one get diagnosed with disabilities or invisible disabilities? Well, there are neuropsychological evaluations, or neuropsych evals for short, that are these really long, basically exams that usually in children, they do them 2 hours at a time over several days. In adults, they do multiple sessions, like usually 2 sessions, about 8 hours at a time. And they include IQ tests, questionnaires, coordination tests, memorization tests, processing tests, and a lot more. And it's always performed by a psychologist. And what's important about that, I should mention as well, is that the full neuropsych eval isn't performed always. Like if someone believes they have anxiety, then they can tailor it more towards more anxiety. And then if the psychologist believes that may not be the case, they may do more tests to do a full diagnosis. And this is important because the reason I bring this up is it's important to note that disabilities aren't just something people say, oh, I have this, I have ADHD. And like, it's actually something that's medically diagnosed by a professional and not just something people say they have. And when you get accommodations, you have to submit this paperwork. They don't just willy-nilly give accommodations. You have to submit this paperwork from the psychologist, and then they approve it based on that paperwork. So now I'm going to go into talking a little bit about ADHD. And how it what goes on in a person with ADHD's brain. This is a little example. So we're going to do a little thought experiment. Is imagine you're doing something, for example, doing homework, and then every time something pops into your brain, you start doing that task. So for example, you're completing homework, you see dirty dishes, you're like, oh, I need to wash the dishes. So you go wash the dishes, you see food, and then you remember you're hungry. So you start making food, but then you realize you didn't brush your teeth today. So you go brush your teeth, and then you look at the clock, and then you remember your assignment is due. And then the cycle starts over and over again. And then all while that's happening, none of this stuff is getting done. And then you have food on the stove, half-washed dishes in the sink. And what is it called? The water could be running, or your assignment is not finished. And what's important about this is the fact, like, none of this stuff is getting done. And that's why a lot of people may see people with ADHD as disorganized or messy. It's primarily because they have so much stuff going on inside their head that they're trying to do all these things, and then in the end, it's just it's the clutter inside their head kind of dissipates into the real world. And I have some pictures of these. Pictures were actually just taken this morning. This is a hanger. I was putting my shirt on. I was like, oh, I need to grab a snack before I leave. And I was like, where do I put the hanger? The drawer was slightly open, so I put it on the drawer because, like, hang it. And then I'm like, I come out and I'm like, why is that there? And then this, you may not have seen the laptop here, but I was looking for my laptop. I couldn't find it anywhere, and then it was just somehow between two pillows and on the couch. And then that's a good example of like what can happen. And it's not that we don't want to do these things. It's that we want to do them, but then we're just like, oh shoot, we need to do all these things. And then you start doing them all, and then it's like, wait a minute, what's going on? And this leads into my next point about something called ADHD paralysis, where it occurs when someone with ADHD is overwhelmed by the number of tasks they must complete. So for example, let's say you're sitting and you're like eating, right? And you're like, oh shoot, I have this project due for CS, and then I have this assignment due for my signals class, and then oh shoot, I forgot to wash the dish, and then like everything just starts spiraling about what you have to do, and then you end up just doing nothing. And because it just creates this paralysis or freeze, because your brain is just so overwhelmed with everything, and it can't pick exactly what to do. So instead of doing one task, it does nothing. And then I have a TikTok that actually I feel like explains this perfectly that I saw the other day. I know it's not the most what is it called? The most scientific source, but I think it's a pretty good what is it called? Representation. Go play. Oh. Give it 1 second. Okay. Oh, I guess it's not playing. Give me 1 second, sorry. That was very loud at the end. Sorry. Oh.
Just open your hand.
Oh, there. There we go. Okay, so that's a good example of what ADHD paralysis kind of does, and it's important to remember because it can cause students to be overwhelmed and not be able to complete an assignment, not because they simply don't want to do it, but because they are going through this, like, basically episode where they have to essentially use coping techniques to narrow down to the one task that they're like, okay, usually there's coping techniques such as like making a list, or like, okay, like I need to focus on one thing and then try to focus on that, but it's still hard sometimes to come out of. This, for me personally, it was very bad in high school. I've gotten a lot better at it in college, but like there would be times where I had a lot of stuff to do, and like even if it was just like simple like homework assignments, I just like my brain just couldn't like start on one thing. So this goes into how ADHD affects me as a student and as a person. Is I'm frequently distracted while I'm in class or writing while completing assignments. I'm disorganized. It's easy for me to make careless mistakes, and then I often turn in assignments close to the deadline or honestly forget them. And then I lose things, as you saw, in weird places, like randomly. The other day, I lost my keys behind olive oil. It was, I don't know how they got there, but it's stuff like that. And what happens a lot is there's this weird thing where like you can know where something you specifically put in a weird places. Like I left my watch in like on the top of the shower one time, and then I like left it there, and my roommate's like, hey, you know where your Apple Watch is? And I'm like, yeah, it's in the shower. And he's like, how do you remember that? I'm like, I remember putting it there. But then like if for something random like your keys, like you won't really like, it's really weird how you just won't remember where it specifically is. And I'll go into, and now I'm going to go into why that kind of happens in a more like biological standpoint and what kind of happens in the brain with ADHD. So it happens in through deficiencies in the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex regulates top-down attention and directs resources based on stimulus relevance. And it's actually, so what also happens is there's actually a defective gene called DRD2. Obviously that's not that relevant, but it makes it difficult for neurons to respond to dopamine. The reason I mentioned that is to say that this is to kind of put down that this is something that is biological and like actually is different with people with ADHD's brains, that it's not just something that people make up, and it's not like, oh, they're just being lazy. And this dopamine, for people that don't know, is the neurotransmitter that is involved in not only feelings of pleasure, but the regulation of attention. And then that's what deficiency and ability to respond to dopamine is, since dopamine is coordinated with attention, is what creates some of the symptoms of ADHD. So now I'm going to go into some common ADHD misconceptions. So like I said before, ADHD is not just an excuse to be lazy. It's an actual neurological disorder. Students, so these are like not direct quotes, but I put quotes there to just say that these are things people say. Students don't turn in assignments on time because they're lazy and don't want to do them. Like I said, this is because of ADHD paralysis, or they legitimately forgot about the existence of the assignment. So one thing, if students tend to forget, forget about assignments, what I've noticed that helped like me in classes is that they're due on consistent days of the week. So I had this one class where the professor made the quizzes on really off days, and like for example, like one week it'd be Monday, the next week it'd be Wednesday, then another week it'd be Wednesday again, and then the next week it'd be Friday. And then I like remember to do the ones due on like Wednesday, and then I'm like, and then I remember just waking up in the middle of the night, I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot to do this quiz. And having that consistency and repetition helps people with ADHD put them in. When you have a routine, it helps them remember to do things. And then another thing is, and I'll get more into other takeaways and stuff that can be done to kind of accommodate people with ADHD in a second, but they can another misconception is that they can focus on other things for long periods of time. Why can't they focus on this assignment? So this is known as hyperfocus. It's caused by low levels of dopamine, and then what happens is the task provides steady stream of constant dopamine. So we like a good example of this is one thing I do want to mention though before I get into the example is that we can't hyper focus over everything. So it's usually more towards enjoyable tasks. If I don't like doing my math homework, obviously I'm not going to be able to focus over doing it. But a good example of this is over the summer I had an internship and I was really interested in the project I was working on. And then I ended up I was at the office and I was like working after lunch. I came back, it was like 1-ish p.m. and then I just kept working, and then I realized it was 6 o'clock, and then my coworker was like, "Hey Henry, are you leaving?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." And I even wanted to continue working, but what ends up happening is because the brain with ADHD constantly craves that like dopamine and that task provides a constant stream, is why that happens. But what ends up happening is once you get out of that, it's exhausted, we're exhausted, and it's hard to then focus again. So it's not just like something you can just come in, turn on, turn off. It's more, and it kind of happens sporadically. It's not really something we can control. And it's not like this ADHD superpower either, where it's like, oh, I can focus on this one assignment for 6 hours, or this one like task for 6 hours straight because I enjoy it. It's more so it just kind of happens. And it's kind of, I don't know, obviously I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't tell you exactly, but that's from my research and talking to what is called psychologists. This is what I've discerned. The next thing I'm going to talk about is anxiety. So we all have it, but just like anything, it's good in moderation. So what happens is thoughts tend to spiral out of with people with anxiety disorders, not only generalized, but like any type of anxiety disorder. So it's like social, there are a few others I can't think of on the top of my head, but with any anxiety disorder, what ends up happening is thoughts tend to spiral out of control. And then an anxiety attack can happen because of any small trigger. So how I tend to think about it is it's a bucket. So when like either little or small or big stressors can add to that bucket. So like, oh, I forgot to do this assignment, or I like this big thing happened. And even the smallest thing, like a what is it called? Not being able to like use a pencil sharpener, like it's not working, can like cause you to have an anxiety attack not because of the pencil sharpener, but because of everything else that happened. And I'll go into an example of kind of like a thought process that this actually happened when I had an anxiety attack in my chem lab, where so the undergrad, this was in Chem 103 when I was a freshman, and then Long Kappa, I just said lab system here because not everyone knows what Long Kappa is, but it wouldn't accept my lab results. For people that don't know, you have to, for Chem 103, you have to input your lab results like into like a computer, and then it checks them. And then it wouldn't accept them. So, and I didn't have time to redo the lab, so I was gonna lose points on the lab. And then then if I don't have the results in, I can't do the pre-lab. If I can't do the I can't do the post-lab. If I can't do the post-lab, I'll lose a lot of points. And then it's the second time that happens, so now I'll get a B. And then now I can't transfer into computer engineering because I'm getting bad grades. And then if I can't get into computer engineering, then I'll have to transfer. And then if I have to that's exactly how, like what was kind of going on in my brain. And then that spiraling continues to the point where it caused me to break down. And you notice how I was kind of starting to speak faster, and like the cadence of my voice was starting to increase. That kind of is what happens in a person with anxiety's brain when that happens, and it causes essentially anxiety attacks display differently in different people, but like it essentially caused me to break down, and I had to like leave the chem lab because I was not in a good place. And what I want to say is that sure, coping mechanisms can work, like, but not all the time. But not like, for example, you can use coping mechanisms, but they like, and you learn those in therapy, but they can't be used all the time. And one of the ways where one of the ways that helps me is when they're in that academic setting, is when there are accommodations. So my TA knew that I had this. It was in my letter of accommodations that for people that know a letter of accommodations, I'm going to get to that in a second. But it's essentially from DRES, the Disability Rehabilitation and Educational Services. It's a letter that they fill out, and it says what accommodations the student has. So the TA knew that I had this, that I had written in there that I may leave suddenly, and that helped me at least being able to leave the situation, not her coming up after me and being like, why are you leaving, like blah blah blah, because chem labs are high stress in general. But so going into accommodations, they're made to create an equitable environment. They are not meant to create an advantage. So an example is extended time or a reduced distraction environment. So I use this picture on the right. I don't know if anyone's seen this. It's kind of commonly used picture, but it's to show, for example, so I get extended time on exams. The reason I get the extended time is because of, not only because of my ADHD, but as you saw, the frontal lobe deficiency on the first one, I have slower processing speed, so it takes me longer to complete math problems or anything that requires intense processing. Now, what that means is that I need extra time to complete the exam, and I may not use that time all the time, but just because I don't use it doesn't mean that that I don't need it. For some exams, it may not be needed because it's more like memorization. But other people also like have extended time, and this is also part of the reason I have it is because of ADHD as well, because you may get frequently distracted during the exam. That's also the reason of the reduced distraction environment. It's to prevent you from getting distracted. And also another reason people may have it is, for example, with anxiety, if you're like getting really anxious, it gives you time to calm down and then get back into your exam instead of worrying, oh my gosh, I'm having this small episode, now I don't have time to complete the exam, and then begin spiraling. And then so that's why extended time is important, and all accommodations are important. One thing that happens a lot is people tend to think with like extended time is like, oh, it's just like you're going to do better on this exam because you have more time to do it. In reality, what's going on is the time is a gateway to, or sorry, is a blocker to my performance, or anybody who has a performance. It's a barrier to access. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. And what happens is the accommodation removes that barrier. And what actually happens is, for example, for me, if I was curious, so I asked like my classmates, I'm like, okay, so how long did it take you to finish this exam? And they say, oh, it took me about like 45 minutes. And let's say the exam was an hour, so I had 2 hours to do it. So, and it generally, I noticed that I tend to take double what they take. So if they take 45 minutes, I tend to take an hour and a half. And then it's, so it kind of is on par. And then that goes to show this picture. It's not that I have more time than my classmates, so I'm like, I'm have an advantage. It's more providing that extra step stool so I can see over the edge. Now there are accommodations are good, but they can fail, as not all students are diagnosed. What I mean by fail is where they aren't really provided. So some students are also not registered with DRES because they haven't been diagnosed or they don't want to disclose. And another thing that may happen is faculty may not correctly accommodate a student, and students may not speak up when that happens. And I'm going to go into an example of that in a second. But what's important is when that happens is to create an accommodating environment. So one important thing is to incorporate universal design into the classroom. So consider some students may have undisclosed or undiagnosed disabilities. So some examples is write an exam that, or like when exams are written, I know TAs, grad students don't really write exams, but encourage professors, like when exams are written, to make them written, for example, for 30 minutes and give an hour, and then or have multiple exam rooms with limited number of students per room. I know some classes that actually have done this, or allow earplugs or noise canceling headphones, providing class materials in multiple formats. So like, for example, textbooks. Some students may need to use a screen reader. So I know a lot of textbooks are more digital nowadays, but allowing like not only printed formats, but digital formats, and enabling subtitles on slideshows. I realized I forgot to enable mine. I meant to have that on, but and then that is something that always helps me. I'll actually enable it right now. But what happens is you can, on PowerPoint, there's just a little button where you can enable subtitles, and that helps everyone. And because or not everyone, but it helps a lot of people. I notice when professors have this on, I tend to be able to focus more because I am able to correlate with what I'm hearing with what's on the screen, and it helps me kind of pay more attention. And with a lot of these things is these universal design concepts, they don't only help students with disabilities, it helps everyone. And that's the thing, is when you design something to be accommodating, you don't have to provide accommodations, because they're not saying that they're not necessarily needed, but it's there to it more removes the need for that accommodation for most people. Some students may still need them, but it at least increases the barrier or decreases the barrier to access, and allows students who may not have accommodations or are unable to get accommodations, because getting access to testing on campus, that the testing I mentioned is actually really hard, but that's besides the point. So this decreases those issues. Oh, I forgot to mention, I mentioned that earlier, making due dates constant. So now I want to give a bad example of an accommodating environment and something that actually happened to me. This is an actual assignment I submitted. As you see, my handwriting is not the best because I have, due to the what is it called, the coordination disorder, I have issues with my fine motor skills. Now it says, if you notice on the instructions, it doesn't mention anything about handwriting. And out of curiosity, can people, are people able to read this out of just curiosity? Like, it may be harder, but is everyone in general able to read it? So what ended up happening is my TA for this was my freshman year, is I lost points on both questions and also for not following instructions, and he claimed it was illegible handwriting. And I submitted a regrade request. I was like, well, it's legible. I had multiple reasons. People try to read it and they said they can read it. And he also gave me mostly points for it. So I was like kind of confused. And he denied it, and he was like, and he said, it is non-trivial to write clearly in order to communicate your ideas effectively. I need to strain my eyes and zoom in for a bit before I can decipher what you are writing, which is why you still have most of your points for this question. This kind of irked me because especially the it is non-trivial part. That's one thing I want to hone in, is something that may not seem trivial or that may be non-trivial to the normal person is trivial to people who is difficult for people who have disabilities. For example, I'm going to go into it like physical disabilities, like with physical disabilities, if you take away someone's accommodation, like you want to tell someone who is in a wheelchair to walk, for example, the same way I don't want to say it like that per se, but it's if you take away their wheelchair and you're like, oh, go walk or go somewhere, they're not going to be able to get there. And it's the same thing with people with invisible disabilities, where they're going to have issues if you are unaccommodated. So what I'm trying to say here is, for example, because it's a little bit more difficult for him to grade, he took off points, and then and it also wasn't anywhere on the instructions. So this matters because not a lot of people, handwriting accommodations aren't given a lot because this usually isn't a problem. And somebody may not even be registered with DRES who has like a fine motor skills dysfunction, and because they're like, okay, I usually don't have issues with this, so why would I need to register with DRES to have to get this accommodation? And yet this forced me to get this accommodation because I had this one issue with this with this TA who did this. And this is important because it takes away from that accommodating environment and basically creates a barrier to access, as it prevents someone from as it causes someone with disabilities to take extra steps just to be treated the same as someone who would not have this disability. And then things to avoid, the why don't they just question. So this is like, why don't they just write meter? Like what he was saying, it is non-trivial. Like, or why don't you just do your homework earlier? Why don't you just questions like that? It's, oh, why don't they just, I don't know, there's a lot of them. I had more in my head earlier, but I kind of forgot about them. But tend to avoid that because it kind of gets into that point where you're how do I explain this? When you ask that question, it gets into that point where you're like ignoring the fact that this is a legitimate issue and you're legitimizing it, and you're like and like I was saying earlier with physical disabilities, you wouldn't tell someone who's physically disabled to why don't they just walk? It's that same way. It's just more like people don't say that because it's more visible. With invisible, it's the same way. It's just hard to conceptualize. And so another thing is, don't assume, like I mentioned earlier, don't assume that students will disclose their diagnosis, and don't treat students that have or that are using their accommodations differently. Like students with invisible disabilities want to be treated the same. They want to, like they don't want to be regarded as differently than their peers. They just want to, all they want is the ability to perform their assignments on the same playing field. And then another thing is being unnecessarily strict with students. This is very common in engineering classes, and I heard it's not that common in I was surprised to know, like from my friends, is that this isn't that common in non-engineering classes. Like if a student submits an assignment 3 minutes late, be more fair to something may have happened where they submitted it late. It happens, and there's been times where professors are like, nope, 3 minutes, that's over the deadline, 11:59 p.m., no more. But the thing is, allowing that leeway, obviously if it happens all the time, that's a more systematic issue, but allowing that leeway gets rid of that barrier to entry. It's the same thing with like if you don't I one time forgot about an assignment. This was my freshman year, and my professor was like, nope, sorry, and I just had to deal with it. But the thing is that happens. I from what I learned, it happens more in engineering than outside of engineering. And then key takeaways. And then some key takeaways also are. I thought I went over this slide already. Oh, yeah. Key takeaways is. Okay. I'm sorry. I thought I changed that. But anyway, some key takeaways is universal design. Don't treat students differently, and remember that invisible disabilities are just as real as visible disabilities. It's just they're a lot harder to see. Any questions? I know that was a lot. Thank you. Yes.
Can I make 2 comments?
Yeah.
Questions? Okay. So first one, I also have anxiety, and you did a really good job of explaining I'm spiraling. I was like, yeah, that's me. So good job. The second thing is the welcoming, accommodating system. I just have like not a personal anecdote, but one of my best friends from undergrad, she now works at a disability office at a community college, and she called us crying once because they had a student. She didn't disclose what the student's disability was, but it had to do with motor skills, and she needed like a specific writing utensil to use the hands. And they were originally trying to give her the felt tip markers to write with, and they just were breaking and splattering all over the page. So her and her supervisor and her coworker were trying to be like, well, let's give her. And the supervisor was, you know what, we're just gonna give this girl crayons and call it a day. And my friend was like, absolutely, like, that's not okay. Like, we can't give an adult woman crayons so they can make exam. So she called us crying, and thankfully, you know, she did a little brainstorming session, and like, she convinced her boss to like purchase these like nice, like, I forget exactly what we figured out, but it was like a art utensil thing. They were a little more expensive, but yeah, like that was an accommodation, but it wasn't, like the crayons would have been an accommodation. So that's one of the thing that you put in there. And then my question is, if someone else who has not necessarily all these disorders, but like a different invisible disability, I feel like I a lot of times have good days and then bad days, and sometimes it's good weeks and bad weeks. So like maintaining commitments, and people who might know me in my good times not really understanding why I'm not as consistent in my bad times. How do you navigate kind of explaining that professionally in the professional environment and academic environment, that like, hey, I might be good right now, but it might not be okay next week, so I need to shift, what I can do.
Would I, that's a tough one, but, would I, because I also have those where like sometimes I'm just like, oh, I'm fine, and then it's just like, uh, but what I generally do is, whenever I've like had issues, with, I've kind of, like, there was one time, something happened and I couldn't turn in an assignment on time, and I worded it in the sense that like, this really depends on the professor or the whoever you're emailing, or you're communicating it to, but I kind of said it vaguely. I'm like, hey, I couldn't turn in my assignment, or I couldn't attend class because of an exacerbation of my disability. Is this okay if, is it okay if I turn this in tomorrow, and then like provided some, or like, and just asked nicely if that was okay. And then most times the professors, like when I had to do that, most times the professors don't pry, but I've heard stories from other students where they do. And that's generally where it's nice to, like, you can go to like, I don't know if you're registered with DRES or not, but you can go to DRES, and your access specialist will then will kind of go and help vouch for you, and kind of is like a third party. So what I would say is, like, obviously is advocate for yourself, but it also gets a lot harder when you get into like the actual workforce, because there is no DRES. But what you can then do is, at least bigger workforces have a common, like, I know when I worked over the summer, there was a disability and leave services office. And if there was issues with that, I could have gone to them. I know when I was applying for when I was doing the coding assessment, they provided accommodations for that. And they said if I needed anything to contact them. But I guess sorry, I kind of got off topic there, but I guess the big thing is try to communicate that this is something that's sporadic and not something I can generally control. Because like it's even written in my letter, that it uses language. It's like, this is something that may happen just out of the blue. And I know I was talking to my access specialist. He's like, some professors still have trouble understanding that. So I wish I could give better advice, but I guess that's why it's good to have these talks, so professors and grad students can understand that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The first is just kind of like a sort of question, but like as a TA, or if you're like teaching a course, and I guess like would it ever be appropriate to suggest a student like go talk to DRES, or like seek assistance in some way, shape, or form? Like, are you starting to see, a system of them acting in a certain way? Is there ever an appropriate way to suggest that?
That's a very good question. I would say that really depends on like how, I would say, how like your relationship with the student is. Like, for example, when I say relationship, I mean more like obviously student teacher relationship, but what I mean is like if they're friendly with you and they would seem more open to it, to like, you can suggest it, but the issue is it could come off as like offensive, like being like, oh, you think just because of this so I would say in most cases I don't think it would be, I wouldn't really say it's appropriate, but what I would say is like, maybe like suggesting, like asking questions like, do you think it would help if you had more time on this exam? Or asking questions like, do you think if you took this exam in a different setting or quiz or whatever form of assessment, would that help your performance? And then if they're like, oh yeah, I think that would definitely help me, you can suggest, oh, you can actually get those accommodations, you can get like accommodations like that through DRES, and they can help you, you can talk to them and they can help you try to, and then that kind of eases the way into that conversation. The issue is that sometimes mentioning DRES can put people off because there's negative stigma with it, which people are trying to get rid of, obviously, nowadays. That's why the point of this talk. But I know in certain cultures, it could be seen as having a disability could be seen as bad. So they may be, or people, I know people like this that never went and got help because they're afraid of their parents finding out and stuff like that. So it's it's a very, I wish I could give a better answer. That was a really good question, but I would say the best thing I would say is lead into asking them if those accommodations would help, and then go from there and see how they respond.
And then I have
Yeah.
a kind of on the opposite end question. If you have a student, there's certain exams and stuff in which maybe they need to finish in order for to hand out to other students, if you're having, students kind of anonymously grade or work on each other's and stuff, how do you be both gracious and accommodating with extra time if they've had a bad week, but also, any recommendations of still, I don't know what it would be like one of our exams, if there's a long answer.
Yeah.
And then we send questions out to different students to grade. So
Okay.
if they don't have it in by a certain time, then everyone else can't grade
Yeah.
in that aspect of it.
Okay. And is this more it's an take-home assignment, or is it more? Okay,
Yeah, but it's a part of their major.
I see. Oh, okay. So it's sorry, I'm just trying to.
Yeah, it's then they can get feedback from other students and then they can make adjustments
I
to
see.
their own questions to get
Okay.
more points back.
I would say talk to a student, for example, the other student, and for example, let's say you and me, I was partnered up with you to do that, where I was supposed to grade your exam, and let's say you had to turn it in late. I would say talk to the instructor. Well, this would be you, but the instructor would talk to the other student, be like, hey, would you be okay grading this a few days later? You don't have to say oh, something happened and they turned it in, but would you be okay with that? And if they said, oh no, sorry, I have this and this, and try to find another student who would be able to respond to it a few days later, assuming that this is only one student. If it's the thing is with turning in assignments late, it should be turning in assignments late and having a little extra time for that is a little different than having extended time for quizzes and stuff. What I mean by that is extended time for assignments should be should be more on not every assignment they should be turning in late, because at that point it's more systematic, but it's more when something happens. And if that happens, I'd say just like I said, find a different student, and then I'm assuming this is something they turn in on a certain date and they have a certain amount of days to complete it, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to take
It's
up
okay.
more time and stuff, but I guess my like challenge is trying to find ways to both accommodating when there are other things that are like relating to a deadline.
I see.
So, if they, like, everyone turns in their questions on Friday.
Yep.
And then, like, then, everyone gets random people's questions
I see.
on that, maybe like 2 days later, because then they get a week to then like review those questions, to then give it back, to then get another week, right, to like adjust and stuff like that. So if the first, if there's like a hard week and that person's then delayed by 4 days or something like that, like the whole process is then delayed.
That's a really good comment, because we actually have the same issue, and I like help design the course, and that's a big issue, because our whole purpose is to help with writing. So the revision process is really important in that, so it's like, okay, well, how do we get people to be able to participate in the revision process if they didn't do the first assignment, right? So I think our solution is mostly obviously dependent, like you said, it will have people to, right, it's one person to be different than multiple, but what we learned is if we put people in like 3 pairs, and it makes it so they can kind of internally decide who's revising who's, and like who has capacity of like looking at something later, possibly who needs to do it now, and please, so everyone has the opportunity to look. If anything, they can also, there's something about it, 2 people from looking at someone who just, overall more confident is helpful. But yeah, so we would make those triangles to try to say like, hey, for one person, still step in. And also, if they never decide to turn it in, then they can still do the revision assignment. There could be 2 people rather than kind of going to the 3. So, sorry, jump in, but I was like, oh, we had that same issue come up. So, speaking of that class, really interesting that you said to keep a routine in things, because we purposely decided to not do exams on the same day every time, because we felt guilty because it was a lab class. So it's like, say if you have lab on Monday, now all your exams are on Monday, so it's also with your labs. We were like, okay, we'll spread the load. But no, what you made makes a lot of sense. So I'll probably bring that up. So I know that's issues for like huge requests. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, like what happened is like I've noticed also there was in an ECE town hall. Yes, there's an ECE town hall yesterday, and people were complaining because in one class it was the quizzes were like randomly on, like they didn't know which like day it was, like where it like changed every few days as well, and these were like in-class quizzes. They weren't even on, they weren't online. Like the class I was talking about, it was like online quizzes, like take home. So it doesn't only mess, I've noticed with like students with disabilities routines, but like just everyone's. But I mean that makes sense. Like you had goodwill with that.
Right.
It's hard to and like with what you were saying, sometimes it's hard to, it isn't easy to accommodate it sometimes, like, and I don't want to make it seem like sometimes there's like oh, catch-all solution. Sometimes it's like there's edge cases, like just like the one you were mentioning with the certain utensil. It isn't easy sometimes, but the good thing is that you guys are all thinking about this and you want to try to, and that's like the important thing. And when like these like edge cases happen, it's good to like talk to Dres, and they like will be more than happy to try to make a solution with you.
So like as a TA, I can like go to Dres, and just like talk to them about a situation without like bringing in a student, obviously.
I think you like if you talk to, usually it's with a student, if there's a specific student, but I'm not exactly sure. I'm a student registered with Dres. I'm not like employed with Dres or anything, so I'm not exactly sure, but I know like if it's, I'm sure they'd be happy to help you even if you don't bring in a specific student. They're usually pretty nice about that. But like I'm sure if not, I'm sorry, I don't want to speak on their behalf,
Yeah,
but
that's fair.
yeah. Yeah, any other questions?
Well, I want to say thank you for sharing, because it opened my eyes to things that I may have been, I guess, that's one.
Yeah.
Really, like the handwriting one, as TA, there's definitely times I never took points off, but I may have made comments. Really, like, but now I feel like I'll be more conscious about that in the future, and I know a lot of, like, I would say the class I was taking, where we always allow them to type, so I was like, why couldn't they just type it, like, but more or less, I guess it's frustrating to hear that engineering has done such a, I'm not surprised by it, like that the faculty have not been accommodating in any sort of way, but like, it's upsetting to hear that, like, when you had an email professor saying like, hey, this is like what happened and I couldn't turn it in, and then you had to go back to dreads. Not only because you're like, they couldn't just take your word for it that you're registered, you have this documentation that they should have all been provided at the start, but then you had to have someone speak on your behalf, like that's more work now. And more things to your list that are not necessarily helping, like accomplish the other things that might be a higher priority for other classes.
Yeah.
So I guess, how do you think university or just like, you know, universities as a whole could do better, or even just like stranger, in terms of like getting faculty to be more just like understanding or open about this? Because like I had some faculty members who have like made it a point to say like, if there's a way that you learn better that I'm not, you know, providing, please let me know. And there was always like check-in forms, but I would say that was one professor out of the many I've had in the course of my 9 years of school, or at least higher education. And it's like, I don't know, that's like, maybe this is the point we all have to talk about, but like that's, it's frustrating to hear that like, you have to do, not only do you have to go through the process of getting registered, which you said is hard, but now if you have an incident that you now have to explain, or that's if you choose to explain, and that can also add extra, you know, just time onto your, and things on your plate too.
Like, yeah, no, I completely agree, because it's like what is it called? For example, with that handwriting thing, that added unnecessary stress, because it's like, oh, I had to then, and eventually the actual professor for the course was actually really nice about it. So I emailed him later as well, and he was more nice than the TA. The TA was kind of rude. But what I would say is like overall is I don't like you were saying is like there are some good professors, and there are some professors also that, like you were kind of saying, that may just not be aware of it. And probably the best way is to, I would say, like as a whole, to realize it is kind of workshops like these. Like it kind of, like you said, it opened your eyes to things. And like yes, like if professors, if not only like TAs were, or grad students were to attendees, but professors and just in general, more awareness about it is, I think, what would help. I know Dress has kind of increased their advertising a little bit, but like it's not, there still is like, there still definitely are professors that aren't really aware, and there are some professors that are just stubborn, and that's where that's a much harder thing to deal with. And at that point, it's actually, you get into the point where if they're stubborn, you get into the law, and you can't really do anything with that, because it's accommodations are protected by the ADA, and it's a whole thing. But obviously you can't always change a stubborn person's mind, but you can at least provide awareness. And I think stuff like this is a really good idea. Yeah.
Question. I feel like in the past couple of years, I've heard different discussions about the language surrounding people with disabilities, and I've heard terms like differently abled or things like that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or just kind of advice about what the proper language is to use around these type of topics, or kind of opinions on that.
It's that's a hard one, because it's like, some people may be comfortable with some things, and some people are like I was saying, there are people of various ranges of comfortability, like with speaking out about this. I'm personally open with it, but some person may, so some other person may not be open about speaking about it. And the word there, I think the reason, like, you were saying, like with the word disability, like like I have heard recently, like there's differently abled. The reason I use disability personally is just because that's what I've heard my whole life. And then like that's what I've kind of been using. And it is common, like I think there, and obviously like there has been like more offensive terms have gotten out of the that were medical before, are not really used as much right now. But in terms of what I would say is, it's like, that's a tough one. It's because like disability is used very commonly. But it's like, I think the reason differently able became used is not to say that they're not, it's not like they're not able to do things. It's that they do things differently. Like for example, I'm still able to complete my assignments. I just may do them in a or do my chores, but I time-wise do them in a different manner than other people. And or it may take me longer. I'm still able to do it. So it's like, it really, I guess, depends on the person's preference. So I would say like differently able would be more politically correct nowadays, I guess. But it's like, it's also, I guess, what you yourself are more comfortable with saying as well. And it's, some people may say, oh, like, don't call it like somebody with who's differently abled may say, oh, please don't call me, or a person with a disability, call me differently abled. And then like, it's like, usually I don't think people like get mad about it, but it's more, that's a very touchy topic. And it's like, it's kind of out of the scope of this. And I'm not saying like, it's not important, but it's like, yeah. Sorry, I went on a little, yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you for like introducing the subtitles. I don't think we got it enough, and we have a grant to do a conference in February. This is definitely something I'm sure.
What's great also is that it'll like transcribe, so when it saves like the recording, it also saves everything that the subtitles did. So if you ever wanted to like reference something and you didn't remember like when you said something, you can just look for that and then type. Is this normally in PowerPoint?
It exists in Zoom. Okay. Oh, Zoom does that. I was like, I didn't know that PowerPoint did that. No, Zoom does that. PowerPoint. Yeah.
I thought this was in PowerPoint. So
This is in PowerPoint. So PowerPoint. So what you do is
it won't save
it won't save a transcript. Zoom will save a transcript. But is there a way I can see? I'm curious if I can show on how it looks on my view. Oh yes, I can. So how it looks on my view is like this, and then you'll see that key over there, where this over here, and then that's, you just click that.
Why don't we? I know, I'm just finding out about it now, but like, departments send out like mass emails to all the stuff.
It's actually interesting. What happened is PowerPoint had a thing where like it notified me like, oh, you can just have it so it automatically turns on anytime you click present. The only reason I had it off is when everyone was like having conversations, I just turned it off so it wouldn't like pick up on your conversations. But then I forgot to turn it back on. But yeah.
No, that's useful. I'm like, I'm a more visual learner, so like, as they're talking, I can
Yeah. It's, yeah, no, one of my professors started doing it and I was really happy about it. It's Nice. Yeah. I really like it when it's like in Zoom meetings, it's very helpful because it's like in Zoom, I lose attention really easily. And having that just helps me pay attention to what's going on. Any other questions?